And what I'm going to do today is, by the way, is going through in the first 20 minutes or so of the meeting, the big book, There is a Solution. Now, There is a Solution is a chapter in the big book. The first 164 pages of the big book have like a lot of they're never changed. It was always the same it was from the very beginning. The rest of the book they edited of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and changed it around. In those days, they had the beginning group of 100 men and women who really started this and wrote the book. And they would have about recovery, 12 steps, and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and alcohol addiction. And today we have meetings and different AA meetings and Alcoholics Society and so forth. But anyway, let me start with the There's a Solution. It's on page 17 if you want to follow along in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous known thousands of men and women who were once just as hopeless as Bill. Nearly all have recovered. They have solved the drink problem. So it's promising us in this chapter, chapter 2, is promises that all has been solved, they have solved the drink problem. We are average Americans. All sections of this country and many of its occupants are represented, as well as many political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. We are people who normally would not mix, but there exists among us a fellowship, a friendliness, and an understanding which is undescribably wonderful. And it goes on to say here, and I think they related this to, back then in 1912, we're talking about history before was the Titanic sank. So it said, with camaraderie, joyous, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to the captain's table. Unlike the feelings of the ship's passengers, however, we join in escape from a disaster does not subside as we go in our individual ways. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one of the elements, is the powerful cement which binds us, but that in itself would never have held us together as we have joined now. So it's talking about this camaraderie, working the program and the steps, and back then they had the alcoholics. They started with Alcoholics Anonymous and meetings for sobriety and alcoholism, and the big book was when they wrote this, they finally had a way that they could put it all concisely in a book, and basically it has the 12 steps in it, and it talks about a program of recovery. And it goes on to say on page 18, but the ex-problem drinker who has found the solution, who is probably armed with the facts about himself, can generally win an entire confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. Until such an understanding is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished. So again, it's saying here that another alcoholic could help somebody. In other words, they would have the understanding, compassion, and how to handle the situation. And they would gain the complete confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. In other words, they would know that they could relate to them because they've had this addiction to alcoholism also. And it goes on to say on page 19, we feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. A much more important demonstration of our principle lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs. So it's saying here that we have an addiction, and there are many 12-step programs, and our addiction is not only to the drug, but it's our thinking. And it says this is only the beginning when we put down the drug, alcohol, whatever the substances that we're utilizing in our addiction. Our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others and how we can help meet their needs. And we have the 12-step program, and in the 12 steps, step 12 says, let me just read that, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. We have recovered, on page 20, from a hopeless condition of mind and body. If you are an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, what do I have to do? So the name of this chapter in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous is called There is a Solution. And again, I always kidding around say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it says. In this chapter, they're giving you the solution to our addictions. It could be drugs, alcohol, food, whatever it is. So, and now on page 20, it's really interesting, and it describes what they call a moderate drinker, a hard drinker, or the real alcoholic. So we have these addictions, either a moderate, and it says here, moderate drinkers have little trouble in giving up liquor entirely if they have good reason for it. They can take it or leave it alone. Then it says we have what certain type of drinker called a hard drinker. He may have had the habit badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally. It may cause him to die a few years early before his time. It is sufficiently strong reason ill health, falling in love, change of environment, or warning of a doctor becomes operative. This man can also stop or moderate. So we're talking about the moderate drinker and the hard drinker. They can stop if reason enough is there, though he may find it difficult and troublesome and may even need medical attention. But now, this is really, and a lot of us can relate to this, what's called the real alcoholic. He may start off, again, we're on page 21 now, as a moderate drinker, and he may or may not become a continuous hard drinker, but at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. So here in the chapter, and there's a solution in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's telling us the three types of addictions. Again, moderate, hard drinker, and the real alcoholic, as alcoholism. And it goes on. So the next important thing in this chapter is on page 22. If we go to the bottom of page 22, we are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens, both in the body and the mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will be abundantly confirm this. So we have what's called an allergy of the body, an obsession of the mind, which leads to what's called the phenomenon of craving. But it does talk about the mind here. It goes on to say, this is the spirituality comes in. These observations will become academic, meaning pointless, it says here on the top of page 23, if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem, the alcoholic centers in the mind rather than the body. So the mind change, and we have these 12 steps here, and it's spiritual solution. We talked about that when we talked about the doctor's opinion and the introduction chapters. And it talks about there's only one solution Dr. Silkworth found in the doctor's opinion called the spiritual solution. Throughout the book and in here, it's going to talk about that solution, and also it's going to talk about how to achieve it. So here we go. Let's go to the next page on page 24. This is really interesting. Page 24 talks about this real, and it's in italics in the first paragraph, and usually, of course, italics means it's important. And it talks about the hopelessness and helplessness of that real alcoholic. And it says here, the fact is that most alcoholics, for reason yet obscure, have lost the power and choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. And how many times do we try to resolve these addictions, and alcoholics found that they couldn't do it through willpower? Because it says here, we are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of suffering and humiliation of even a week ago or a month ago we are without defense against the first drink. So it's saying we can't do it. Our self-will, no matter how much we tried, or an alcoholic, they realized couldn't do it. And they talked about the scientific knowledge of the day. All the doctors and scientists, whatever they tried, couldn't resolve the alcoholism. And it goes on the bottom page 24, with this sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he probably placed himself beyond human aid. Beyond human aid. We always tried to resolve these addictions through human aid. And here it says, with the alcoholic, it was beyond human aid. And unless locked up, may die or go permanently insane. These stark and ugly facts have been confirmed by legions of alcoholics throughout history. But for the grace of God, there would have been thousands more convincing demonstrations. Many want to stop but cannot. Then it goes on page 25 and it's called There is a Solution. So here it's telling us the solution that they found for the alcoholics and alcoholism at the time. And it says, there is a solution. Almost none of us like the self-searching and leveling of our pride. Again, almost none of us like the self-searching and leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcomings which the process requires for successful consummation. But we saw that it really worked in others, and we had to come believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it. When, therefore, we approached by those in whom the problem had been solved. So it's saying right here, and there's a solution, when we had been approached and people have the problem resolved, we can't do it on our own self-will. We became to realize, and it says right here, there was nothing left for us. So here's a solution, but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. And that's the 12 steps, the 12 AA principles and virtues, the 12 steps they had of Alcoholics Anonymous. We found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. So the solution to the problem was they realized they couldn't figure it out, all the doctors and scientists. We couldn't figure it out, no matter how much they tried on the intellect and trying to figure it out. They realized they had to be rocketed in what's called the fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. And at that point, the alcoholics started to realize they were using the alcohol as a way, as their higher power, and that they could resolve their issues. And the solution actually was the alcohol. If they had a drink, they would feel better and things would be great. But the thinking had to change, because once we talked about the alcohol came into the body, they had the allergy of the body kicked in, the phenomenon of craving started. And it goes on to say, so the fourth dimension we had not even dreamed. And they're talking about all of life and all the problems and all situations. And it goes on to say, the great fact is just this and nothing less, that we've had deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude towards life, towards our fellows, and God's universe. So again, my best thinking got me here. So they started to realize the alcoholic had this shift in thinking towards making alcohol the solution. And here it says these are revolutionary changes, and our whole attitude had a shift where we got centered and we found the answer in the spiritual awakening and being rocked in that fourth dimension, which is really in us all the time. And it talked about the defects of character we block out. It's called the sunlight of spirit by our defects of character. Basically the ego and self-centered pride, as it said in the beginning here, that it said almost none of us liked. All this is on page 25, pretty amazing page in the big book. Like the self-searching leveling of our pride and the confession of shortcomings. So it says, which the process requires for successful consummation. And again, it goes on to the essential factor of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. So here it's talking about the solution. What's the solution? A spiritual solution. And step 12 says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. So it says, the essential factor of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. So the alcoholics at the time, they started to realize they need a perception change, that whenever they tried to fight their addictions, they couldn't do it on their own. That their best thinking, the more they tried, the more the addiction took a hold of them, because it was actually what they needed was a complete design for living, and just abstaining alone, although that's very important, did not resolve the problem, because eventually that says here, when we read that day comes when we cannot know the truth from the false and not even remember the memory of suffering, humiliation of even a week or a month ago. And this applies to all addictions and all types of addicts who have these different addictions. And I realized at the time they had this big book. They didn't have the meetings. They didn't have back then the AA meetings came about, with time. But what they did is they sent out this book, and really the first 164 pages talks about this, and it never was changed. Although the big book has 600 pages, they kept these all intact in the same way. And these pages are what's called There is a Solution, and the steps are involved in this first part of the book. And they include the chapters. Starts out with the forwards, first, second, third, and fourth edition. We are reading from the fourth edition now of AA Alcoholics Anonymous big book. But then they have Bill's story, There is a Solution, which we're reading now. Another chapter called More About Alcoholism, We Agnostics, How It Works, Into Action, Working with Others, 2 Wives, the Family Afterward, 2 Employers, and A Vision for You. So again, we had just read what the solution was, this higher consciousness, spirit of the universe, whatever you want to call it, and the steps do say, a God of our understanding. He has commenced to accomplish those things for us which we could never do by ourselves. And it goes on to say, when it's talking again about the human aid doesn't work, it says here, if you are a seriously alcoholic, as we were, we believe there's no middle-of-the-road solution. We are in a position where life was becoming impossible. Our lives become impossible with our addictions. And we had passed into region of where there is no return through human aid. Again, it's talking through the return through self-will, human aid. I couldn't do it, or the alcoholics at the time, they realized with these addictions, there are many 12-step programs, couldn't do it. They didn't have the couldn't do it through human aid. The solution really was, it says here, to accept spiritual help. Now, it goes on to say, there's a really interesting here, and it talks about a story of Roland. Actually, the story's about, it doesn't mention his name here, but his Roland Hazard was a very successful son of a very wealthy family in New York. And what he did at the time, the history is very interesting. There was a Dr. Jung and a Dr. Freud, Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis. This was in the 30s, but they took off starting in the 20s. Freud was the main one, and they were in Europe, and Roland Hazard went to Europe. It's that he couldn't get an appointment with Dr. Freud, but he got an appointment with Dr. Jung. And what happened during the appointment, he went all the way over there because he couldn't get rid of his addiction to alcoholism, and he would try anything. In those days, it wasn't like today. To get over there was like, he had to take a boat. It could have took, a pretty long time and a lot of effort, but he went over to Europe. And it says here what happened after he spoke to the great Dr. Jung. Above all, Roland Hazard believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fall. So after all of this, and going, and he knew, he actually analyzed and knew exactly, he felt the inner springs, meaning how his mind worked, and he could figure it out through his intellect. It said he became drunk within a short period of time. So what happened was, he went all the way, he came home, and then he got drunk, and then he went all the way back to Europe. So he felt he wanted to regain this, what's called self-control, relating to the self. So he went back to Dr. Jung, and he goes, "Doctor," he begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to be placed himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. It's all on page 26 near the bottom. This was the great doctor's opinion. And it goes on to say, but this man still lives and is a free man. He does not need a bodyguard, nor is he confined. And it says, men may go without disaster provided he remains willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. Again, it says willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. And here they're talking about the solution. The doctor said, and this is what the doctor replied when Roland Hazard just begged him. He says, what should I do? And he felt it was hopeless. And the doctor said, initially, it is hopeless. There's nothing we can do for you alcoholics. But then the doctor said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent it does in you. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed in on him. He said to the doctor, is there no exception? This is related to all of us here in our addictions. And he said, yes, replied the doctor, there is exception to these cases such as yours, have been occurring since early times. So here we're talking about the solution. So if you listen closely, he's telling what it is when Roland came back. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. Again, have had called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomenon. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. So he's telling here what a spiritual experience is. Ideas and emotions and attitude which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate him. In fact, they've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangements within you. So he's saying here there is a way out, and we have it here called the spiritual solution, a design for living where we have that complete shift in consciousness, and we come from, whereas before we made our addictions, we were addicts, and making the alcohol our higher power, as they did in those days, and he said that there could be a complete rearrangement. On hearing this, our friend was somewhat relieved. So he started to realize that he had possibly these convictions, so there was some hope there for Roland. And it says here on page 28, we in turn sought the same escape with all the desperation of drowning men. It goes back, what seemed at first a flimsy reed has proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. So it says here, the powerful and loving hand of God, a spiritual solution, a higher consciousness, which the steps talks about at least 6 or 7 times in the 12 steps. A new life has been given us, or if you prefer, a design for living that really works. A design for living is what you need. And then it goes on to page 29. Further, on clear-cut directions are given showing how we have recovered. Further on, clear-cut directions are given showing how we had recovered. These are followed by 42 personal experiences. It's talking about in the big book here, we have the stories and personal experiences, and people go, today we have meetings, of course, and speakers that speak at meetings on these topics, as we're doing here. They're very important. Each individual in the personal stories describes in his own language, from his own point of view, the way he established his relationship with God. So it's talking about here the spiritual solution. And again, the name of the chapter is There is a Solution. It's through the 12 steps. So it pretty much summarizes in this one chapter that the hope that there's a solution like Roland Hazard had when he went over there. And to reiterate, on page 25, it talks about this spiritual solution, where therefore we are approached by those in whom the problem is solved. And it goes on to say the great fact is just this, nothing less, that we had deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude towards life, towards our fellow, and towards God's universe. So there's a solution. And it says here, we had to realize we were beyond human aid. That's it, we're beyond human aid. So we're in a program, and it's based on this book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's also Step 1, say we're powerless, and it talks about the food and food addiction. So everything applying to here is applying to most of us are the variety, the real food addict. And then we have a solution here, and there's a solution.